Herman, appreciate you taking the time today.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, listen, I'm excited to dive into your terrific new book, Burn, all about your work in metabolism over the last 10, 20 years. How long's it been?
Yeah, about 20 years now,
Okay.
measuring calories.
And that kicks off my first question is what was the impetus for the book to write it now for you?
Yeah, well, it was a lot of things kind of came together. We were at a good point in the research. We had been doing the work that really sparked, I think, a lot of this interest, general interest in this kind of work, as well as my own research over the last 10 years, started with this hunter-gatherer project we did about 10 years ago with the Hadza in northern Tanzania. We can talk about that in a little bit.
Sure.
But a lot of that work kind of came to fruition, and I worked with other populations as well. And I felt like we had a really good handle on this really interesting observation, which is that our bodies are keeping total energy expenditures, total calories burned per day, kind of in this narrow range. And the next phase of this research is going to be years spent trying to figure out all the pieces there, the mechanisms by which that happens, by which the body adjusts. But we were at a good point. We, I think, made this observation in several human populations across several species. It was a good time in my life to write a book.
Nice.
I thought it was something that I wanted to get out there. And so, I just sort of set the record. There's also, I think, a proliferation. This might always be true. Maybe it's just anytime you pay attention, you notice this, but a real proliferation in books purportedly on metabolism. They didn't have a lot of metabolism in them.
So you felt that you should, definitely set the record straight. And, fascinating, obviously, your work in Tanzania. And you share some great stories in the book, which makes it great to dive deep into the science, but then pull back and give a really nice picture. Could you walk us back through that first time that you're getting off the plane and you're going out to visit the Hadza? Like, what was that experience like?
Yeah, it was prolonged. The lead up was really long. So it took us about 2 or 3 years to get funding to even be able to do it. The reason we wanted to go measure total energy expenditures in a hunter-gatherer population was that nobody had done it before. But what was funny was when we applied to get the funding from National Science Foundation to do it, the reviewers kind of all said the same thing, which is, well, who cares about this? How interesting is this going to be? We know they're really physically active. So obviously they're going to burn tons of calories. And so, why even bother to do this? And so it took a while to get the funding, convince them that it was worth doing. And we kind of agreed. We thought, they will have high expenditures, but we want to see how high they are. And then it took years. It took literally a summer, me and Dave Reichlin just sweating it out in Dar es Salaam, getting permits, because of course, to do this kind of thing ethically, you need to get permits from the national level all the way down to the regional level.
Yep.
And then finally, when we finally were in the Land Rover, packed up, and of course that, getting your Land Rover packed up and getting all the local stuff taken care of is its own adventure, like going into the markets in Arusha, which is the last city you get to, not really a city, the last sort of big town, little city you get to before you are off into the woods, into the savannah. That's its own adventure. Working, getting a Tanzanian research assistant with us on board. And it was a whole trip. But as you're finally rolling in to that first Hadza camp, it just really feels like, like you're rolling onto the set of a movie or something like that. You can't, it just feels kind of surreal.
For sure.
You're rolling in and they don't know you're coming because there's no way to get a hold of them ahead of time. There's no, cell phone service out there hardly.
Yeah.
Certainly 10 years ago, there wasn't any. And you just kind of show up, and you show up in the middle of this wonderful camp of kids running around, laughing and smiling, and adults kind of hanging out, and, grass huts and people coming back from hunting or coming back from foraging. And it just sort of you just feel like you walked onto the set of a movie almost. Like it just seems so different. And that's the initial reaction I think a lot of people have. Certainly the initial reaction I had.
Well, definitely when you get into nature like that, I mean, I've only experienced that sort of backpacking and things like that, where you get to, some great stories with the different insects and animals and everything else. Now, as you know better than anybody, calories are king and the currency in the body. And, you talk about how the Hadza do a lot of walking. I like the excerpt where I think at the time was that your supervisor was saying, we don't have to say when they're walking because we'll just assume they're always walking, how much they walk, right? But you were saying how women cover about 5 miles and men cover 8.5, more or less, miles per day. But then you also write how we don't actually get more efficient with walking for a lifetime. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So it's this funny sort of constellation of observations. They walk a lot, and they don't not just walking, they're also picking berries or digging up tubers or hunting game or climbing trees to get wild honey. So they do a ton of physical activity. If you actually measure, so one of the things we did is we brought out 2 systems to measure energy expenditures while we were there. One was this stuff called doubly labeled water, which is this isotope enriched water that we can use to get 24-hour expenditures, total calories burned. And that gives you about a sort of a week-long snapshot or 10-day snapshot of calories per day. We also brought out this briefcase kind of style portable respirometry system from Cosmed. It was state of the art at the time, and it's fantastic stuff. And you wear a little mask, and that hooks up to this chest harness thing, and it weighs a couple pounds, and it's a little wearable laboratory basically, and it's measuring for the mask. You're measuring oxygen consumed and CO2 produced, and so we can measure the energy cost of different activities. And so we've done a few activities now, but at the time we were doing walking, because we wanted to know, do you get more efficient? Like, yes, do you get more efficient if you spend your life walking?
Yeah, 100%.
And the answer is no. They burn about 50, you have to correct for body size with these things. Big people spend more energy just to walk because they're big and they're moving a lot of body weight.
Yep.
But even after you correct for that body, because they tend to be smaller bodied, right? So just in pure calories, they actually spend fewer calories than the typical American because they're just smaller. But once you account for body size, it's the same. Yeah.
I was going to say, and then what happens when we start to run? Because obviously, whether it's the London Marathon, the New York Marathon, trying to get fit, we're trying to burn calories, we're trying to obviously have all the health implications, but we also work on our form, right? We want to be able to improve our form. And, I'm sure that has some benefits, but in terms of this energy expenditure piece, can you talk about what may or may not be happening there?
Yeah. So it turns out the training doesn't have a big effect on running economy either. So we're talking specifically here about the energy you burn per kilometer or per mile or whatever, right? Yeah. And so, walking, you can spend your whole life walking. You don't really get any more efficient at it. You can spend your whole life running and you don't really get much more efficient at it. In fact, if people have done like the training, the training studies on this to see if you get somebody who doesn't run much, but a little, and get them running more and more and more, can you measure any small effects of economy, any small changes? And the answer is usually there's nothing. And the biggest effect sizes anybody has published is about 4%. 4% more economical, 4% fewer calories per kilometer after 6 or 8 months of training. So it just isn't really a big effect. In fact, I think the jury's out on whether there's any effect there at all. You can run with your arms across your chest and it hardly has any effect on energy economy. So, if all this stuff about form and practice, what you're really training is your endurance, which is a different thing than how many calories you're burning. You're just kind of training how long you can keep up a certain level of intensity for. And
at the tip of the spear, Herman, like at the elite level, is that still going to matter then, that exercise economy piece? Or are we starting to think that that's not actually making that much of a difference?
Well, I mean, sure. If you're talking about, the difference between, a 2:10 marathon and a 2:11 marathon, well, that's, less than 1% difference, right? So theoretically there, it could absolutely matter. There's a great, if you've read the Alex Hutchinson book, Endure, and he kind of breaks down, all the different components of trying to run a sub-2 marathon. It's one of the pieces he talks about in the book. Economy is going to be a piece of that, but for, the 98% of us, even at the pretty darn high end level, and certainly those of us in the middle of the pack, it just isn't a big effect.
And what's going on when we talk about some of the, these days running ultra marathons is becoming more and more popular. I mean, with I've got a lot of midlife dads and clients who are taking it up and losing a lot of weight, and we naturally think that this is due to the energy expenditure piece. Can you give us a quick review of basal metabolic rate and how this whole story starts to interconnect, and what are we actually seeing in these people who are losing weight?
Yeah, that's right. So for me, it starts with that Hadza study again. So we went out, we measured these folks, total energy expenditures with a Hadza, really physically active, and yet they're burning the same number of calories every day as men and women in the US. And that's after you correct for body size. Okay. So a really physically active population don't burn more calories per day. We've seen this again and again in other populations other human populations around the globe. We see this in animals. So this is a pretty strongly observed phenomenon that activity level does not dictate how many calories you burn per day.
Yeah.
Now that's a different question than if your midlife dad decides to start an exercise program, right?
Yeah.
Is he going to burn more calories 6 months from now than he was when he started? And the answer on there is it kind of matters. It's not clear entirely. You start that exercise program for a while, you're burning more calories because you're exercising more and your body's not adjusted to it yet. After you adjust to it, and that takes a couple months, you're going to start, your body's going to start kind of dialing back other expenditure on other physiological activity. So there's a lot your body does that you don't ever even know about. It happens, underneath the hood.
For sure.
And, that gets dialed back. And so at the end of 6 months, maybe that guy's burning a few more calories a day, maybe no more calories a day. We see both of those outcomes in longitudinal exercise studies. In any case, he won't be burning as many calories as you'd expect based on, I added 200 calories a day to my life in exercise. You're not going to see 200 calories a day more in 6 months. Your body will have eaten some of that up, maybe all of that up by these adjustments. And so that means that any weight loss he sees, he's either going to see very early on in the beginning, when he's still expending more because he hasn't adjusted yet.
Yeah.
Or if he is able to maintain a bit of a higher expenditure, his body's going to adjust by eating more, and he won't see, so I think that's a lot of people's experience. You start a new exercise program, you see great results for a few weeks in terms of weight loss, and then you might continue to see other great results. You should still keep doing it, but the weight loss goes away as your body adjusts.
Yeah. Can you speak to kind of the evolutionary mechanism there? Like it sort of seems unfair today when a lot of people, 2/3 of the population are overweight or obese. You've got all these metabolic conditions and chronic diseases of lifestyle. And yet, obviously we've got this, I wouldn't say hangover, but it's, from our evolutionary past. Can you talk about the why is that?
Well, so energy expenditure is about all the things your body's doing all the time. And most of that we're not even aware of. So, your brain runs a 5K every day, right? Your brain burns 300 calories a day, just doing its job. And your liver burns a lot of, so your body's doing a lot of things. And all the energy that your body's burning is not to make sure that you have a beach ready body for June, or even to keep you healthy necessarily. All of your body's systems are tuned and calibrated to be really good at taking energy from your environment in terms of food and channeling that into survival and reproduction, right? That's really that's how evolution shapes any organism, including us. And so your body should be really good then, and we'd expect this for any organism. We see it in all kinds of species, at taking as much energy as it can, basically, as it can dependably get, and using it all, but not using any more, right? Not using extra. Yeah. And so your body's going to try to meet that intake and expenditure piece really perfectly, and it usually does a pretty good job.
Yeah, it is incredible. And when we talk about calculating these, RMRs for whether it's athletes or clients, and we hear a lot about whether somebody has a fast or slow metabolism, how much are we actually changing over that RMR measure, depending on if someone's naturally leaner or naturally more heavier set?
Yeah. Well, so body size is the biggest predictor of how many calories you burn, because it's, again, it's all the systems in your body at work. That's your metabolism.
Yeah.
Where we can kind of control the activity piece of that, but we can't control all of it because it's all of us, your liver isn't under your control, for example. And so bigger people, there's more of you and you burn more calories. Smaller people burn fewer calories. Even after you account for body size and age and anything like that, you're still going to see people who, you and I, maybe similar age, similar size, but it wouldn't be a surprise to anybody if you burned 200 calories more a day than I did, or vice versa, or even 300 calories difference, right? There's just that much variability in metabolic rates. And it's not tied to lifestyle in any obvious way, right? There's actually a lot of variances that we just can't explain. What's interesting is if we were to ask you, do you have a fast or slow metabolism? Yeah, you might have an answer to that. If we get you into the lab and measure it, the odds that your experience of if you think you have a faster metabolism or not actually matches if you do have a fast metabolism.
It's not very good.
Not a very good likelihood there. Because, when people say I have a fast metabolism, they usually mean I can eat whatever I want. I don't feel like I gain weight. Or if I have a slow metabolism, I feel like no matter what I do, I gain weight. And that's a different question than how many calories you burn every day.
Yeah, I was going to say, in terms of when we talk about appetite regulation, if we shift gears to the brain, certainly this is having an effect of people who feel more satiated and actually they feel like they're eating whatever they want, but they're actually not feeding that many opportunities in a day versus somebody else. Yeah. Can you speak to the brain's role there in terms of appetite regulation and perhaps from an evolutionary standpoint as well?
Yeah. Well, so again, your brain is really good at matching calories in to calories out. And, the systems that do that are pretty well known at some level now. We're kind of learning more all the time. But obesity, getting overweight and obese, is usually an issue, sort of a creeping regulation issue, where you're just a little bit off. Mm-hmm. And we're talking like less than a 1/10% off, like tiny amounts.
Wow.
A little bit off in terms of intake versus expenditure on average. And so you gain a couple pounds a year. Well, you gain a couple pounds a year, you go from being a healthy weight 20-year-old to being an overweight or obese 40-year-old. That's that is the American global, that's the American obesity epidemic. And I think it's becoming the global epidemic, right?
Absolutely.
And so this is a brain regulation issue. And, the evidence for that is sort of the way that it develops, but also, for example, if you look at the genetics of obesity. So people have, I think that this isn't work that my lab does, but people who work on genetic variants and the genetics of obesity, I think there's almost 1,000 different genes who, depending on which variant you have of this gene or that gene, affects your likelihood of becoming obese. And all of those genes, with few exceptions, are most active in your brain, right?
Interesting.
So it's not your liver, it's not your muscles, it's not your fat cells, it's your brain. And it's because that's where the rubber hits the road. How well do you track and match intake to expenditure?
Yeah, and you talk about in the book, the Hadza obviously with, getting honey or getting a piece of fruit was pretty exciting. To get that sweet taste out in nature isn't something that you normally stumble upon. And so it always brings me back. Actually, I'm over here in the UK. There was a picture of the beach on a hot day in 1976, and everybody's out there. And of course, everybody looks sort of slim or normal BMI. And then just recently, last year, it was a really hot day, same picture. And again, you're up to 50, 60%. So when we talk about this food environment and that evolutionary hangover of wanting to keep eating, I mean, how can we resolve this when, just as you mentioned, it looks like it's becoming a global issue?
Yeah. Well, so, we just talked about how the genetics are involved, but of course the gene pool hasn't changed from that picture of the 1950s to today, right? The genetics changes, gene pools change much more slowly. So it's obviously it changes the environment, and it's the food environment. I think all evidence points to it's the food environment. And the big problem is, well, it's probably a lot of things, but if you had to point your finger at one thing, it's this predominance ultra processed foods, right? These engineered combinations of salty, sweet, right, fatty, crispy. It's this melange of flavors and textures that our bodies, your brains, are never evolved to experience. Right, a Hadza man or woman never experiences a Domino's pizza or a fried ice cream or a deep fried Snickers bar or something like that.
Yeah,
and it just completely overreacts, right? It's the reward systems go crazy, and it's people have shown it's basically similar to addiction, right? It's similar in that in response to addiction, and you overeat because it's engineered to make you overeat.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's fascinating. I mean, over here in the UK, Canada, the US, I mean, it's more than 50% of everything we buy is ultra processed food.
Yes.
And I find over here, I mean, you take a train to Paris, it's 2 hours away, and all of a sudden it's 14%.
Wow, is it really that low?
Yeah,
I didn't realize it was that.
16%. And so even when I hear about, the Mediterranean diet, obviously sort of like the quote unquote gold standard of healthy diets, if you will, but it seems like the theme, of course, across all these different countries is just they're eating more real food, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely it. And, I think in some ways that's a story we've heard before. But I think, what I try to do in the book and what I think, hopefully more recent research is kind of pointing out is that really is the nub of it, because what happens is we say, oh, it's ultra processed food. And Coca-Cola says, oh, sure. But you better make sure you exercise too. And it might also be that, oh, it's carbs, not fats, or it's fats, not carbs. And all this kind of smoke screen stuff goes up, right? To obscure what is a pretty simple message, which is these engineered foods that are literally engineered. This is how they know they're doing a good job, is you overeat them, right? That's what we're surrounded with. So if you had to do one thing, if you could wave your magic wand, it would get rid of those processed foods.
Yeah, 100%. And if we circle back to your book and the benefits of exercise, you go through obviously the metabolism, and you're talking about how there's not this big effect, but obviously you pump the brakes to everyone and say, look, it doesn't mean you can't exercise, or you shouldn't exercise rather. And you talk about the benefits. Can you just revisit some of the benefits as it relates to metabolism and healthy weight?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, that's right. So just because exercise by itself isn't a great tool for weight loss, and might not even get your daily energy expenditure to change very much because your body makes those adjustments, those adjustments are actually what's good for you, or part of what's so good for you. So we can first of all say that there are a lot of benefits of exercise that have nothing to do with the calories burned, right? That have nothing to do with calories at all. So stronger muscles, sharper mind, right? Better immune function, getting outside. If you're exercise out, there's mood effects, right? So
Sure.
there's all these great effects that have nothing to do with calories, and you should exercise. If it was only that, you should exercise for those alone. But the calorie stuff is actually really exciting because it turns out that all those calories you burn on exercise, the big effect is that those are calories that are taken away from other functions. That's the way you can think about it, right? So if you spend a lot of energy on exercise, your body's going to spend less energy on inflammation. It's going to spend less energy on stress reactivity. We think it's going to help keep your reproductive hormones in a sort of safer range. And so, those are all really good things, and so that's just adds to why, in other words, the metabolic adjustments don't take away from why you should exercise. They actually add to why you should exercise.
Yeah, it's amazing how it, as you say in the book, it impacts every part of the body. There's nothing that goes untouched, and whether it's mental health, physical health, all these things are paramount. But if we actually circle back to that elite athlete question, what I really found fascinating was when you start talking about metabolic scope in the book, and the boundaries of human endurance performance. How fast can we go? How many calories can we actually burn? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. Well, so there's a couple pieces of that. One is as you push against, if you push your body too hard for too long, then you start taking energy away, from things that you need to do, right? So we just talked about how if you take energy away from things that you shouldn't be doing anyway, like inflammation, that's a good thing. But at some point, you're going to be spending so much energy on exercise that you won't have any energy left for the stuff you actually need to do. And that leads to things like overtraining syndrome or relative energy deficiency syndrome, REDS, right? So there are bad things that come of this eventually if you push too far. So how far is too far, right? And we had a really fun time doing a study once. We had people running from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., a marathon a day for 5 months, totally impressive. And we measured their energy expenditures. And they were really, really high. And so we had a really fun time doing that project. And I thought, gosh, this helps. Maybe this is kind of relevant to this question of how far can you push yourself? Or if energy expenditure is constrained, how constrained is it? And how long can you break the rules? And so I took those data and put them in the context of a full data set that had things from like, the Kona Ironman Kona Triathlon, Western States 100, Tour de France, right? Pregnancy, which is also this really long-lasting, high-intensity thing, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. Requires calories.
And you can map out the kind of the ceiling of human metabolic expenditure, right? So you can push above that constrained ceiling for a while and do something like the Tour de France. Yeah. The higher you push, the shorter you can go, right? It's kind of like sprinting versus running a mile. Like if you go really, really fast, you can only go for a few seconds. If you push your energy expenditure to 10,000 calories a day, you can really only do that for a couple of days. And then, you can do the Tour de France at I think it's like 7,000 calories. You can do that for a month, right? These guys who ran a marathon a day, they did that for 5 months. That's like 5,000 calories a day. Sorry, 5,000 calories a day. Anyway, so that's the ceiling. So you can actually map out the ceiling of what the human body can do. And as you push up against that, that's when you start to run into trouble.
And that's something, we heard all about Michael Phelps and the Olympics and 10,000, 12,000 calories. These things take on like mythological sort of, they spread like that. And is someone actually eating that much? How much can we consume to really push that threshold?
Yeah, that's a good question. We think that one of the things that came out of that study where people ran from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., and we put all this data together from other studies too, we think the body's limit to getting energy in effectively, right? Not just putting it in your mouth, but getting those nutrients into your bloodstream. We think that the limit there is about 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day for people. We put it at about 2.5 times your basal metabolic rate, which for most of us is about 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day. If you're bigger, maybe you can go, then your level is going to be higher because your whole system's going to be larger, right? And smaller might be smaller. The whole Michael Phelps thing, he might be burning 10,000 calories a day for a couple of days in a row if he's, really pushing it.
Yeah.
I don't think he's eating that many calories a day. And that turns out what's funny is the 12,000 calorie day thing ended up being a bluff anyway. But yeah, it's we don't really know how many calories a day Michael Phelps can eat, but we should study it. It'd be great if he wants to come to the lab. We'll check him out.
Yeah, no, it is fascinating. And, you talk about how, that 2.5 times basal metabolic rate is sort of the number, right? That's terrific. And when we look at, one of the things I wanted to circle back on was you talk about your time in the Hadza and and foraging, spending time getting your food. Years ago, I worked in the south of France, and just to watch the chefs actually make everything from scratch, they're actually moving around quite a bit versus just dropping the ready-made pasta into the boiling water like we might do in North America. And you talk about, rates of what about the Hadza adults are roughly 1,000 to 1,500 calories per hour foraging. And some of the other foraging farming societies, about 1,500 to 2,000. Can you talk about just the amount of energy it requires to just go find your food every day and the implications for health?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a lot of energy. They're spending a really large portion of their daily calories just on moving to go and get food, and they don't go hungry, right? I mean, for one thing, they share, which is this interesting, unique human strategy, right? No other animal does the kind of sharing that we do. And certainly no other primate shares like we share. And so there's kind of a real beauty to that, the kind of sharing that you and I take for granted growing up, going to birthday parties or barbecues or whatever, right? Or sharing lunch at work. Like that's actually a uniquely human thing that kind of unites all of us. Anyway, that's kind of on a tangent, but I just love that about our species, that we're this kind of sharing species.
100%. We need to get back to more of that with politics and everything.
Well, yeah. So it's funny, right? Because
you got to remember that part of us.
Yeah. Because, we're really good at sharing and being nice to our group. Now, who's our group? That's where it gets tricky, right? Mm-hmm. And we're often trained. You grow up, your family's your group, obviously, in your school, maybe in your neighborhood or whatever, your sports team, I don't know who you root for. Obviously, when the Olympics come on this summer, right, you'll be rooting for the Maple Leaf and I'll be rooting for the Stars and Stripes, that's how it goes. Or maybe you've changed allegiances. Have you changed?
No, I still working for Canada basketball, so I got to stay.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. That's great. So it's like, who do you root for? Who's your group? And all of that comes back to, why do we do that? Like, that's a weird thing to do. Why do we get so worried about, why do I feel bad if the Steelers lose? You know what I mean? Like, why should I care if 22 guys in Pittsburgh have a bad day at work? Yeah. But I do, because they're my tribe, they're my group, and that's how I was raised. I kind of can't shake it. Actually, it's really hard to get rid of that, and all that group membership comes back. It's all because we are your group membership is so important, because that's who you share with, and fundamentally that's who you share food with, right? Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
I was going to take a tangent there and just talk about, obviously with technology today, we seem to be pitting the tribalism, of like the others seem to be more prevalent. I don't know if you have any thoughts on.
Yeah. I mean, I think a few things there. One is, politics has always been about how you define us versus them, right? And I think, if anything, politicians have gotten better and better and better at tweaking us like that. I mean, everything, isn't it crazy? I don't know if this is true in the UK as much as it is here, Brexit versus Remain, and, leave versus stay. Or if it's in the US, everything, every decision, whether you wear a mask to prevent COVID, right, became this issue of, are you a Democrat or Republican, right? And that's because of, are you my group or are you the other group? And so everything gets colored like that. It's really dangerous. It's kind of it's not healthy. And I think online, like, first of all, there's no penalty, right? Yeah. To stand up and shake your finger and yell at somebody. Well, you have an anonymous ID on Twitter or whatever, and nobody's going to come and, so there's no cost at all to yelling at somebody. And it also is like, you could have the most niche, weird, maybe even harmful, toxic identity, and that's what you think, and you're going to find a million other people just like you online. So no matter how bad it
finding your tribe.
Yeah, there's always a tribe. And I don't know that that's a helpful thing or not, but I mean, I don't know. Hopefully it also still goes the other way.
Hopefully we'll figure it out. Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah.
But circling back to the foraging question, the calories, love a good tangent, but the cost of a calorie today versus even 100 years ago in North America versus, if you go back to these populations, can you share some insight?
Yeah. Right. So they go out and they spend a lot of their energy foraging. And, you can think about this in different ways, but a hunter-gatherer can get between 1,000 and 2,000 calories an hour, depending on what they're going after and if it's a good day. But that's the ballpark. Let's say 1,500 calories an hour, just as an average. The typical blue-collar worker here in the States, not working a special job, a median income job in manufacturing, could take the wages from an hour's work and go buy 20,000 calories of food easily. I mean, like, we're talking like 20,000 calories of like a normal stuff you might put in the refrigerator, not something weird or crazy. 20,000 calories of normal food. So you go from a context where food is actually kind of hard to get, 1,500 calories an hour, to 20,000 calories an hour. And now you're just, even if you don't experience it this way, it is nonetheless true that you are swimming in calories all the time. Making it that much harder to make good decisions about what you eat.
Absolutely. And one of the areas, we see when people are consuming ultra processed food, all the bacteria in the gut microbiota start to shift. And Nick West out in Australia talked to me about some research around the calories that these gut bacteria produce. And some people can be more, some people can be less. What are your thoughts on the effects of that? And might that be significantly different between those hunter-gatherers, I would presume, compared to someone who's obese in the typical standard setting?
It could be. We know that there are microbiome differences for sure. Some of work's been published for the Hadza, for example, the group I've worked with. I think it's an open question. It's something we're actually trying to look into. How many of those calories that otherwise would just sort of pass through you are your microbiome bacteria able to scavenge and turn into short chain fatty acids from your fiber or whatever and get into your bloodstream? God, that'd be really exciting to know. I don't think we know yet, but I agree. We need to get that sorted out. It's a big area to look at next.
Awesome. And I imagine with the Hadza, what's the fiber intake like with that group? Pretty 50, 60, 70, or is it more than that?
We think it could be 80 grams a day.
Wow.
Does that sound right? I think they have that right.
Yeah. We struggle to get 30 in North America.
Yeah. It's tough. So they eat this really, really fibrous tubers, and they eat them, but they're so fibrous that you don't usually just eat it. You usually like chew it and suck all the starch out of it. And then you spit out the quid.
Yeah.
And so somebody's dissertation someday is going to be going around collecting quids and figuring out exactly how much, because, obviously it looks like you spit out all the fiber, but there's no way you do. You end up breaking it down and chewing. Yeah. You eat a lot of fiber that way, but how much, that's a bit of an estimate. So
it's like baseball players chewing tobacco, although much healthier version. And, if we kind of zoom out again and talk today, obviously we hear a lot about plant-based versus animal-based, and in different hunter-gatherer societies, you write about how there's a lot of misnomers around the diets and actually how those diets change based on latitude. Can you speak to that?
Oh, sure. So one of the funniest things I think doing this kind of work, being someone who has the privilege to actually go and work with hunter-gatherers is to be told by people on Twitter how hunter-gatherers eat. I always find that really funny. And if you were to just pay attention to Twitter, you would find out that hunter-gatherers eat only meat all the time, and that's all. But that version of a paleo diet or something isn't actually what we see at all. No. Hunter-gatherer diets are really pretty balanced between plants and animals, and more than that, they really vary over time. So day to day, week to week, even year to year, there can be really big shifts in the calories you're getting from plants versus from animals versus from honey. Honey is actually a really big contributor of calories for the Hadza and other tropical groups, even temperate populations. It's not until you get into the Arctic, well above 50 degrees latitude, and that you see people who are really heavily meat based. And most of us aren't from there. There are some folks who are, population. But most not. Even this is another one I just saw on Twitter. Somebody said, "Oh," I pointed this out to someone, and they said, "Oh, but so you mean that my Northern European ancestors were eating 80% meat? Cool." And I thought, well, okay, actually, your Northern European ancestors got there about 5,000 years ago from a group called the Yamnaya, which are hanging out on the steppe in southern Kazakhstan and that part of Central Asia. And so actually they were eating plenty of plants and everything, and they came in and displaced a bunch of hunter-gatherer groups there. So, this whole question about your identity and where you're actually from, very, very few of us are from, a very far north population. Some people are, but very, very few.
And, you also talk about the genetic adaptations we would think that these individuals would be more ketogenic with a protein and a really high fat diet. But there's some, evolutionary shifts that occur that would be not the direction you would think, right?
That's right. Yeah, in the Inuit and other First Nations people that we see in the Arctic, who really have been there for, as far as we can tell, for 6,000-7,000 years. There have actually been really strong selection on the pathway that allows you to turn. So you make ketones when you are breaking down fatty acids predominantly for your energy. And so what happens is one of the molecules that gets kicked out of that pathway is a ketone body, and your body can use those. You can use ketones for energy. But there's a whole set of pathways that have to happen for that ketone body to get kicked out. And one of the enzymes that's critical for that in that pathway is actually, there's a selection against the gene that makes that enzyme, against the form of the gene that makes that enzyme. So they actually can't go into ketosis, a lot of these groups, even though they are the poster child for the ketogenic diet.
Yeah, and from an evolutionary standpoint, is obviously some type of protective mechanism there, or what would you speculate?
So somebody pointed out to me, and that it might not be about the ketones exactly, that there might be some other role that enzyme plays. And so I don't think that we know exactly what's going on there. If it's, is this selection that happened because of ketosis and ketogenesis specifically, or as a byproduct of something else? So I think the jury is still out. I don't want to speculate too much.
Yeah.
But I would say that what you can say is that here is a population that was all set up to be the perfect ketogenic population.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, that wasn't a strong enough draw to maintain ketogenic ability there, right? They actually got pushed away.
Yeah, no, it is fascinating. And, you touched on this earlier, but in terms of some of your work now, in terms of the things that you're investigating, down this path of metabolism, you touched on more work with the Hadza. What are some questions that you're really trying to answer now?
Yeah, what I think the next horizon for us is to do some. It's going to be hard work, but do the long-term studies. The year-long or even longer studies where we get people who are relatively sedentary, get them exercising, and watch all the other physiological systems change in response to that exercise, and see what gets turned down and how much and what that mechanism is. There's a lot of work to get done there, because right now I think that's that mechanism we don't have pinned down as well as I'd like. I think there's questions too in terms of how this these kind of constraints on metabolism affect things like growth, reproduction, how well we age. I think there's sort of life history questions to be addressed there, so that would be fun.
Yeah.
And I'm an anthropologist, so hopefully we'll get to do more of this in some more fun places and learn more. I think just to do the basic exploratory science of saying, wow, nobody's worked with this community before. Let's work with them and see what they have, what we have to learn from them. So hopefully there's more of that coming up soon too.
Oh, that's incredible. And just wrapping things up here, I want to respect your time. Again, so many great stories in your book, and you talk about obviously the sharing being one of them. You talk about one of the children as well, a pair of children that go off to a school and then decide they don't like it, and they just come back through the lion infested. Could you just touch on, in all your experiences there, from that human level, some of the things that you learned in interacting with the Hadza?
Well, I think the first thing you're knocked over with when you go work with the Hadza is just I think, like I started off saying, it's so surreal, it feels so different. And then after you're there a few weeks, you kind of get into the pace of life there. You just begin to realize that actually, people are people the same all over the place. So the kids are running around, and I've got little kids, 9 and 6 years old. And so I go to a Hadza camp and I see those kids running around, and I think, it's just like home. They're just like my kids running around the backyard. Husbands and wives are like talking like, well, who knows what, same kind of stuff. Women are arguing, men are, men are arguing and, or telling jokes or whatever. It's just, I think that's what I come away with, is that even though, the cultural sort of facade, the cultural layer of it is so different. The language is different. The clothes are different. The food is different. We're all just sort of all the same people, just right beneath the surface there. And I think that's what I walk away with all this stuff. But the kids are amazing, because I tell you what, you grow up quick in a lot of ways out there. Those kids could walk without trails or a compass or a map. They wouldn't think twice about heading over the horizon towards the camp. They knew it was over there. They by dead reckoning and figure it out. I mean, 5-7 years old, they're already walking 2 kilometers out to get water and 2 kilometers back. It's amazing.
It is amazing the skills that you can build when
Yeah.
that's your environment. Herman, I really appreciate you carving out some time today. Phenomenal book, Burn, the deep science, but of course, the great frame of reference with the stories and whatnot. So appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks so much for having me on. It was really fun.